he's not here for Sunday school this morning. He's traveling today, so I'm here as a substitute. And we have a movie clip. It's from it's about Genesis, and I thought once in a while it's good to take a break and kind of do some like scientific things. So that was interesting. I think it's the one today. There's a couple of them. It's about genetics, that kind of stuff. So I thought it was good. So we're gonna do that.
Is this like the last one?
Yeah. Same thing, but different. Or different clip. I think they're interesting. You know.
When we talk about DNA, I think most people are probably thinking about all of the human DNA now that comes up. And what are we learning about the DNA of the human being?
You know, since we started DNA analysis, basically most everything we've learned has contradicted the standard model, the standard out of Africa idea. The idea that humans and chimpanzees share a common ancestor, the idea that Neanderthals are not human. There's all these things that have come up that are completely contrary to what anyone expected.
And how do we then refute that old story about Africa?
A lot of different ways. First of all, we've got DNA sequences now from thousands of people from all over the world. And there's just some things that are very clear. And the first big surprise was how similar people are from one end of the world to the other. That was not what people expected. I mean, back in Charles Darwin's day, he was trying to split people up into races and almost into species. Other people claim they were different species. Darwin never quite went that far. But the evolutionists were trying to divide people up into tribes and clades and groups. But what we found out through gene sequencing is that people are nearly identical from one end of the world to the other.
Well, what does that commonality of genetic code across people all over here, what does that tell us? What do we learn from that?
It tells us tons of things. First of all, it tells us that we all came from a single small population just a short time ago. It tells us that there's only been one dispersal of people across the planet. It tells us that the center of diversity of all people in the world is somewhere between Northeast Africa and the Middle East. So the origin of mankind is pretty much where the Bible says it was. The origin of mankind involves a small people group, just like the Bible says. The origin of mankind involves a dispersal across the world. Everything we're learning is pointing more and more toward a biblical answer for the origin of humanity.
How do we come to the conclusion that the human race has not been around that long?
Well, one thing we can do is we can look at the mutation rate that we can measure in the laboratory. We can take a bunch of people that we know are closely related, we can look at their DNA, we can count up the number of differences between them, and we say, okay, that's the rate. Now let's look at all the people around the world. How long would it take to explain all these people given the rate that we know? And the answer is a few thousand years. For both the man's lineages, which is the Y chromosome, and the female lineages, which is the mitochondrial DNA, both of them give us a similar answer that people are not millions of years old.
Tell me more about the different chromosomes that come as a result of being male or female. How does that help us understand this?
Because there are two specific small pieces of DNA that are passed down to generations unchanged, most chromosomes, they recombine, and so the genes get scrambled. But the Y chromosome is only inherited from father to son, to grandson, to great-grandson. And so if a mutation occurs, it stays only in that lineage. There's this other little piece of DNA called the mitochondrial DNA that, from a lot of experiments, it's only passed on from the mother to the child. So my children did not inherit my mitochondrial DNA, they inherited my wife's mitochondrial DNA. Because of that, it's also passed like the Y chromosome from one generation to the next, unchanged. Except if a mutation occurs, you have a new lineage. And so when we look at the Y chromosomes around the world, it is abundantly clear that they're all very, very similar to one another. And if we count up the number of differences between them, it's 500 or 600 differences, maybe as many as 800 at the most, can explain all the men in the world.
Oh.
Wait a minute. At a mutation rate that we know, we'd expect a couple of mutations per generation. That's only a few hundred generations. That's biblical time frame right there. For the mitochondrial DNA, most people in the world are about 20 to 25 mutations separated from the mitochondrial ancestor, Eve. Well, that's just a few hundred generations.
So what we're seeing here, there's a stark difference between a Genesis paradigm approach to how man began and how long he's been around, as opposed to the conventional paradigm that says man has been around for millions of years and in various stages. And what you're saying is the genetics don't seem to support that.
Genetics, if we use real-world mutation rates measured in the laboratory, the genetics indicates that man is very recent. But there's another factor we also have to account for, and that is what happens to mutations over time in a population. See, every child that's born has more mutations than the parent was born with. That means that every generation is actually a step down from the ancestors. And at the rate we can measure, it's, 60 to 100 mutations per generation is a nice average. At that rate, we will go extinct before millions of years happen.
So there are really two ways to look at this issue. One is how fast the mutations are changing, and because of that, we can't have been around that long.
That's right.
But if we have been around that long, that mutation rate would have
Killed us.
we
We would be extinct. The standard model, the evolutionary model, requires that mutations are removed over time. But there's not enough time. There's too many mutations, and it overwhelms them mathematically. Back in the 1950s, this famous scientist named Haldane, he said that if there's as many as one mutation per every 10 children, we're guaranteed to go extinct. Well, there's about 100 per child. That's 1,000 times worse than the worst case scenario they can handle mathematically.
And what you're saying then is that this evidence really is pointing back again to the biblical historical record.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When we look at just people all around the world, they're so similar to each other. It's clear we came from actually an atom. So little bit, like I used to have a red beard, right? It's all white now, but this red is a mutation. It's a broken gene. I don't have brown hair anymore, or the skin color that one of my ancestors picked up. This is a broken gene. We even know where the gene is. We know what letter change happened in that gene. And all Europeans share that skin color. It's a broken gene. So we need a little bit of genetic diversity, 6,000 years of mutation, and we can explain people with no common ancestry to chimpanzees. We don't need millions of years. We don't need evolution.
Concerning the chimpanzee, the conventional paradigm tells us over and over again that we have like 98% similar genetic code with the chimpanzee. Is that true?
It is absolutely not true that we're 98% identical to chimpanzees. Some of my colleagues have run the numbers, and when you just take a piece of the chimpanzee genome and look at the human genome, you get about 80% identity. And when you do the reverse, you get about 80% identity. This 98% was a myth. When they sequenced the chimpanzee genome, they didn't want to spend $3 billion on it. That's how much it took to do the first human genome. In order to sequence a genome back then, what they would do is they would randomly sequence lots and lots of little pieces, about 300 base pairs long. And then they would line them up. They used a big computer program to line them up. And if you had enough pieces, you fill all the holes. And then you have to sequence it about 30-fold over. And then you have enough to make sure you don't have a gap. When they did the chimpanzee genome, they sequenced it 5 times over and lined it up on the human genome. So they assumed common ancestry without ever testing it, and they made a Swiss cheese genome. There are so many holes in the chimpanzee genome, it's not usable. So several years later, someone went back and they only resequenced just the Y chromosome. And it turned out to be radically different. The Y chromosome in chimpanzee is half the size of the Y chromosome in human. And of the half that they share with us, it's only 70% similar to the human version. the paper that did it, they said that that was as much difference as we expected between man and something like a chicken.
Well, for sure, what we know is that the human being is radically different than any of the other animals that we see around us. In fact, it's only the human being that can create that scuba gear that I was wearing to keep me alive underneath the water.
That the humankind is the only kind, the only species that God created that has the capacity to wonder and marvel about the world that God created.
Well, I want to learn more about it. But in the remaining time, maybe we can do some more underwater stuff. Huh?
The weather's really nice. Let's go on another dive.
Let's do it. So, what would I be doing on my next dive?
The next dive will be the same as the first dive.
Yeah.
Maybe you'll stop and have more time to stare at something.
Yeah.
It'll have to be a guided dive.
Yeah, one more. This guy.
Rob, when we talk about DNA, I think most people are probably thinking about all of the human DNA now that comes up. And what are we learning about the DNA of the human being?
Let me see. This clock. Oh, okay. This is one I want. Let's see. One more. Design. There it is. This is the paradigm. This is it. All right.
Oh, look at this.
Now that's a memory storage device.
It's its own.
I know, it's amazing.
It's an amazing place. Oh, this brings back memories.
Look at this thing. Must have taken up a whole room.
Yeah, this is the monster computer that I started with. Massive tape drives everywhere.
Your time with the 360 is a slice of your history, but
Yes.
actually the story is longer, right?
Well, it is, because I did my degree in computer science there,
Yeah.
and then worked in artificial intelligence in a graduate role. Then at Auburn did graduate work in software engineering, computer
Yeah.
science, and then eventually got my doctorate with a minor in computer science. And
Yeah.
in between there, working in software systems in the Air Force and on space systems, the whole gamut.
Yeah. So you lived through all kinds of changes in this technology from the beginning of your undergraduate years right on through to your doctorate.
That's exactly right, and that's why I'm here. That's why we're talking.
Yeah.
We're at this incredible computer history museum with all of the artifacts
Yeah.
that show us the progression of this amazing technological revolution that's occurred.
Right.
And no one would question it.
Yeah.
I mean, we have the artifacts, we have the history, the historical statements,
Mm-hmm.
but when we move back to origins,
Right.
and this is your expertise,
Yeah.
we have artifacts and we have historical documents, but all of a sudden we have radically different opinions of what those artifacts and that history says.
Radically different. In fact, you're looking really at what are competing paradigms. A term that I first encountered as a 19-year-old art school dropout reading Thomas Kuhn's classic The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which revolutionized my own understanding of science. And you gain a vision from that book of science as a creative human enterprise where assumptions It can't be escaped. And depending on the assumptions that you choose, you can end up with very different narratives. So we've got data, we've got evidence, we've got, in effect, artifacts, but those pieces of evidence are being interpreted in very different ways depending on the assumptions that one makes. So really, science isn't just about the evidence, it's about how you interpret that evidence. So these competing paradigms will put you in very different places depending on which one you're in.
So it comes down to paradigms.
Oh yeah. A paradigm governs really everything that you think about a particular subject. It provides this global framework. So this room, for example, we've got so-called mini computers here, but really they're not mini at all in terms of our current paradigm.
Yeah, today, right?
Yeah, this,
Yeah.
right? So really, to understand this question of origins, you really need to begin by looking at the governing paradigms, the two major views that we currently have about the history of life and the history of the universe.
And what are those?
On the one hand, we have the conventional paradigm. This is the view that the universe began a long time ago in a very simple state, and by strictly physical processes developed gradually and continuously into all the complexity that we see today. Galaxies, stars, planets, cells, animals, human beings. It's one long continuous story from a very simple beginning to today. That's one view. The second view we can call, let's say, the historical Genesis paradigm. Strikingly different. First of all, you've got recency. Right? This is not happening over a very long time. It's happening relatively recently, and it begins in a state of functionality where it's working already. You've got organisms present, they're doing what they need to do. You've got planets and solar systems already operating, brought into existence, really within a very short span of time, simultaneously. Homo sapiens is present right there, right at the start. So those two views contrast really at every point, and their key features are also very different.
It's not hard to see there's a radical difference between those two in terms of time.
Right.
What else do you see is contrasted here between these two paradigms?
To me, the most striking difference is what kinds of causes are operating. So in the conventional paradigm, it's physics running the show. Physics through chemistry, influencing biochemistry and then biology. All the change that's happening is coming bottom up from fundamental, undirected, mindless physical processes. They're doing everything. In the historical Genesis view, underlying everything is mind, is intellect. A purposeful intelligence is bringing things into existence. That's a profound difference. Another key difference is the actual sequence of events. So in the conventional paradigm, you have a gradual process whereby things are constructed beginning on what came before. So ultimately, really you start with elementary particles, hydrogen and helium, heavier elements, galaxies are formed, planets, and so forth, leading eventually to the first cell. It's a continual process of gradual transformation. With the historical Genesis paradigm, you have a transcendent intelligence, God acting in space and time to bring things into existence, in a sense, discontinuously. And that pattern gives you discrete events in space and time that aren't strictly flowing one from the other. So you have the creation, you have the fall, which is a catastrophic event that affects all of the creation in a radical way. So again, you see a striking difference in the narrative that one would tell depending on your starting point. And lastly, and maybe this is the most important, what is the whole of reality? Is it strictly physical? Are we, meat machines that will decay into nothing upon our death? Or is there a spiritual dimension to our existence that is eternal, that has eternal value? And really, that final point is the one I think that's most decisive because it ends up affecting how we treat each other. And science is one thing, but our moral sense, our relationship with God, We can't have a relationship with God if we are strictly physical creatures. So finally, on that fourth point, you see the deepest difference between these two paradigms.
Well, Paul, what we've described here are two paradigms that really have very little similarity. They are almost light years, if you want to use the phrase, light years apart. And it seems to me that the result of that is also radically different in terms of how I see myself.
Exactly.
Who am I? All of those philosophical questions.
Right.
Why am I here? What's the purpose of life? Is there any meaning in all of this?
Right.
And the paradigm that begins with natural processes and ends with natural processes, it's hard to find meaning.
It's hard to find meaning. In fact, the very concept of a deeper meaning, a deeper purpose, has no purchase in that view. Because if you're ultimately particles in motion, when your particular bag of particles ceases to be in motion, it's over, right? That is not the view of historical Genesis, where you are created, yes, as a physical object, but there is more to you than just your particles. In fact, there's infinitely more. And so, really, the difference ramifies out into every aspect of human life, which is why this question of origins is so important. It's not just a scientific matter. It's not just a scientific debate.
But it seems to me that the evidence that we have here is available to both of these paradigms if you just look at the physical evidence.
The physical evidence is a common body of data that both views draw on and interpret, but they're taking from that common body of evidence very different meanings. They're going in very different directions. It's a bit like having a crime scene where you've got two detectives and they've got the same patterns, right? One guy says it's this, the other says it's that. They're going in quite different directions away from the same body of data.
And it seems that they're going in different directions because one paradigm is listening to a witness telling you the story of what happened,
Yeah, I like
versus the other one who's just looking at the physical data.
Right.
Because isn't that what we have in the historical Genesis paradigm?
We have a witness to those events. And that witness is telling us this is what happened, and we have to take that into consideration when we evaluate the data.
Well, that brings me to an issue I know that you've heard often, and I want us to look at this for a second, because one of the strong accusations against those who hold to a historical Genesis paradigm is that it's not based upon science. But that can't be true. Doesn't this paradigm also look at the reality of the physical evidence?
Oh, of course it does. The problem with that objection, which I'm familiar with, is it's smuggling into the word science an assumption. And when someone says, well, you're not looking at it scientifically, what they're presupposing or smuggling in is you're only allowed to use physical processes. But you couldn't live a single day thinking that way. Every time you get a text on your phone, you know, someone leaves a note in your car door when they bump your car in the supermarket parking lot. Normal human life depends on our ability to detect the action of intelligence. And we don't collapse intelligence into strictly physics. So if a scientist tells me I'm not allowed to use intelligent design to understand or explain the world, I ask him, how do you get through your day? Right? Because you're doing it all the time, very reliably. Science in its deep sense, its original usage in Latin meant knowledge. We know that Stonehenge was constructed by an intelligence. That conclusion will be true when our current theories of physics are long gone. So these inferences to intelligence are very robust, they're strong, and they're fully rational. So I think that the objection that you mentioned is really misdirected, and it's question back.
Yeah. Well, Paul, just as we're standing here in this computer history museum, no one would say that all of this amazing technology just simply arose as a result of physical processes. We wouldn't do that.
Right.
we know that an intelligent being, we saw the pictures of all of those amazing people who each added their own intelligence as a part of this process, and yet what we're dealing with is a paradigm that is not willing to accept that.
It's a funny thing about the use of intelligence in explanation. It would be profoundly irrational to say that these devices self-assembled. In fact, no one would say that because it's simply not true. But when we come to things like the origin of life, the origin of the first cell, the origin of humankind, there, the agent in question, the intelligence in question, wouldn't be a member of our species, Homo sapiens. So suddenly the temperature in the room goes way up because the implications for saying the first cell was caused by a mind suddenly involve things that look a lot like theology. And it becomes a much more difficult question for people to evaluate objectively, which is why these questions of origins, as I said a moment ago, aren't really simply scientific questions. They spill over at every point into theology, into philosophy, into these deep questions of who am I, why am I here, where am I going? So I think in many cases for scientists, they function with a split personality. They would say, yeah, a mini computer had to have a designer. I asked, how about a eukaryotic cell? Vastly more sophisticated in its engineering, if you will, than any of the devices we've looked at. Now, that hypothesis of design that was rational for the mini computer suddenly becomes problematic, not because of the evidence, but because of what it entails, what it implies about the universe.
It seems strange, of course, for those of us who hold to the Genesis paradigm, to see that people would point back to Babbage, or to Seymour Cray, to those people that we know or have the intelligence behind all of this. But it seems like there's the barrier when all of a sudden that begins to be gone.
Yeah. You know, what's so funny to me is the same features in these systems, these computers, that we say are diagnostic of an intelligent cause, such as integrated functionality, the role of information, and so forth. Those same features are present in a single bacterial cell, but at a much more sophisticated level. So I see a disconnect between evidence and inference, going from evidence to cause, that really can't be explained as a question of science. What's happening is at some point along that pathway, there's a bypass or there's an off-ramp, and the rational chain that should lead you to a designer takes you off in a different direction.
It seems that one paradigm is drawing on a history that was given to us,
Yes.
and another paradigm is constructing that history. Is that how you see that?
Well, it's constructing that history under a set of constraints. The history can only appeal to physical processes. So, if in reality a designer or creator did act discretely in space and time, they can't detect that because they've ruled out that possibility from the start. If you look at a puzzle and decide that certain answers are unacceptable to you, it really doesn't matter what the evidence is. You're never going to discover those answers. So if you begin doing your history with an assumption, I'm only allowed to use this restricted set of strictly physical causes, you will be unable to discover the true history if the true history involved an intelligence.
Well, Paul, the reason this becomes serious is that we're not talking about a history of just boiling water at a certain temperature. We're talking about a history that deals with the origin of the universe. It deals with the origin of life, the origin of humanity, the origin of sin and why there's evil in the world, the origin of the geological formations that we have around us, the origin of language. I mean, this is history that is not minor. This is dealing with major elements of humanity and where we are.
Yeah, you're talking about the origin of literally everything. And I think if we zoom out from that and say, well, what really is the difference between these two paradigms? It isn't a question of science on the one hand versus religion on the other. because both of them are scientific in the sense of looking at a common body of data. Really, at the deepest level, the difference is two competing views of history. What is the true history of our cosmos? And in that light, I think it makes a lot more sense to look at them as paradigms that draw on different accounts of history with different implications.
Oh, this is incredible. These are software languages, programming languages. Starting with Fortran, and it shows, I guess all the lines are showing the commonality to some extent. I know Fortran. I learned a lot of these languages. This line here from Pascal to Ada, I know both of those. Ada is the language we use to develop that large command and control system in China Mountain.
Wow. You know what's interesting when you look at this diagram? It superficially appears to be an evolutionary tree. But in fact, what this represents is an enormous, incalculable amount of creative activity by human intelligence. Each of these languages required at least one author, often more than one, right? And all along this pattern, we see human creativity bringing these things into existence.
That's exactly right. In fact, if you look at this and you think in terms of evolution, you might think that Pascal, for example, kind of evolved into Ada. Well, I don't deny that there were some similarities, but I can tell you, there was a whole team of people that were working on the development of Ada.
Right.
It wasn't a matter of taking Pascal and somehow squeezing it and putting it under pressure and popped out Ada. There was a lot of work that went into that.
Language, if you think about it, can give you goosebumps because it's a symbolic representation of reality. You know, going from the physical world and the immaterial world. I mean, we have languages about mathematics, and mathematics is immaterial. Going from those worlds into our own consciousness in a way that we can recreate those realities and express them to other people in symbolic form. And, you know, one aspect of that is these computer languages. To me, all of it evincing design. We don't see language unless we have intelligence present. And we see language of a higher order present in living things. I'll tell you something funny about Fortran. A German team looked at the regularities in Fortran. That is, the ability to predict the next symbol in a string of symbols based on what came before. Fortran is less complex than the base sequence of the yeast third chromosome. So the DNA sequence in the yeast third chromosome is more irregular, packing in more information than Fortran. In fact, the yeast third chromosome, this sequence of symbols, is almost perfectly random, except that randomness gives rise to functional proteins. So in a comparison, what you would have to say, if you're consistent, is DNA represents a language of an extremely high order. I think DNA is, as an information storage medium, has what we've developed beat hands down. So you can pack the 3 billion plus base pairs of DNA in the human genome, wrapping them up as we find them in real cells, into something that's so small you need a microscope to see it. Yet there is an enormous amount of information in that tiny space. That's information storage.
Yeah. I've heard that DNA information and all that's contained there would fill volumes and volumes of books in terms of the lines of code, maybe millions of lines of code. When we developed the system for Cheyenne Mountain, it was about a total of 40,000 lines. It took us a year with a very sharp, crack team. And most of our work was done to try to make sure that there was no errors in it.
Right.
Because an error in software you develop is disastrous.
Yeah.
But here we're talking about the information in a cell that is so good and so refined that it does amazing things.
It does amazing things, and the fascinating thing about all cells that we know is that they too have error correction mechanisms. They want to maintain high fidelity transfer of information. So there's error checking there as well. The same rules of information transfer, namely minimize noise, maintain your signal fidelity. present in these codes, present in living things.
Isn't that awesome?
Yeah.
All right, we're just gonna wrap it up right there. Just some interesting information. I always think it's interesting to look at this stuff, gives you more perspective and all that good stuff. Also, it's always fun to hear computer scientists explain computer code. Alright, well, we will close with the word of prayer before we go on to the reading of the service. Heavenly Father, we're so grateful for this day that you've given to us. And Lord, as we go into the remainder of the service, Lord, we pray that you would just open our hearts and our minds to your word this morning. In Jesus' name.